For those of you who joined us early, thank you and hi. We will start the event in precisely 1 minute. Hello, everyone. A very good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone who joined us here today. I am Tejasi Panja, and I work at the Internet Freedom Foundation as the Associate Policy Counsel. I would like to formally welcome you to the event on Caste and Technology, co-hosted by Bahujan Economists and Internet Freedom Foundation. The event is currently being live streamed and will be available for future use and viewing after the event. Now, before we speak about the event, let me briefly introduce the two partnering organizations. Bahujan Economists is a platform for researchers, scholars, students, and professors belonging to the SC, ST, and OBC communities and economics to collaborate and support each other. The group's objective is also to put forward our perspectives that have largely been absent until now from the discipline. It also provides support to students of marginalized communities in the field of economics. IFF is an Indian digital liberties organization that seeks to ensure that technology respects fundamental rights. Our goal is to ensure that Indian citizens can use the internet with liberties guaranteed by the Constitution. We work across a wide spectrum of issues with expertise in free speech, electronic surveillance, data protection, net neutrality, and innovation. And we aim to champion privacy protections, digital security, and individual freedoms in the digital age. Now, about the theme for today's event, that is caste and technology, for which we have all taken our time on a Friday evening, for which we are once again very grateful. We know that caste-like technology is pervasive and thus has an effect on an individual level as well as on a societal level. While certain positive affordances may promote upward and social economic mobility of marginalized communities, the negative affordances might enhance the social stratifications and hierarchies deeply entrenched in our society. In this event on caste and technology, the speakers Dr. Murali and Aarushi Kalra will examine the intersectionality of caste and technology and the myth of a caste-less technology. The speakers will also elaborate on the discourse or the lack thereof around caste in sensitive tech, the global developments related tech, and the need to attend to digital rights issues from a caste-oriented perspective. Now, about your speakers for today. Data and Society faculty fellow and anti-caste scholar Dr. Murali is a postdoctoral researcher at the Oxford Internet Institute. Murali's academic research concerns the disavowal of the protected categories in media and communication studies and digital cultures, especially caste. Dr. Murali's work is a result of his lived-in experiences of casteism and the effects he witnessed on what media, communication, and technologies can do to mitigate one of the world's ancient social hierarchies and the caste system. Aarushi Kalra is a PhD candidate in economics at Brown University. Her research interests lie at the intersection of development and political economics. She also develops machine learning methods to answer questions of causal inference in observational settings. She is also the co-founder of Bahujan Economists. Welcome, Dr. Murali and Aarushi. We're very glad to have you here today. So, Dr. Murali, let me begin with you. You have spent years studying the effects of media, communications, and digital cultures from anti-caste perspectives in South Asia and the global diaspora. You recently also released a first of its kind syllabus for critical caste and technology studies, available online for every student, teacher, or concerned individual to access and use. So, first of all, congratulations on that. So, why don't you start this event by giving us an insight on why digital rights need to be discussed from a caste-oriented perspective, whether this has been missing so far in the discourse, and if so, why we need to address it. And obviously, we can't go forward with this event without talking about your syllabus. So I'll hand over the mic to you for now.
Okay. I think if it needs a lot of unpacking. So if I can begin with what I mean by caste from communication studies and science and technology studies perspective, and then I can unpack some of these points that you raised, and then eventually I can talk about the syllabus as well, if that's okay with you. Yeah. Okay. I mean, first of all, thank you, Internet Freedom Foundation and Bahujan Economists for actually hosting me and creating this space for me to actually say what I want to talk about, I'm passionate about. And especially thanks to Apar and his colleague, yourself and Shilpa and others, Ashley, everybody who actually made this happen. And grateful thanks to Aarushi, who has agreed to converse with me, comment on what I'm going to say, and perhaps challenge my perspective, only to further anti-caste solidarity alliance across the board. That's very important. The topic, the title itself is quite broad. Caste or technology. It doesn't necessarily have to actually boil down to caste and digital technology or internet technology. However, for the purpose of this particular space, I'll focus just on internet and digital technology, but where appropriate, I'll acknowledge something beyond digital and internet technology as well. I think we all know what caste is, and it's often a bit tiring to explain the same thing, because sometimes some people have a different way of explaining things. But I think what I would probably say, why it needs some sort of unpacking from communication studies point of view, and how that will help science and technology studies to build caste sensitive science and technology policies, digital rights, and to build cost-sensitive digital regulations and practices. That's what I'm more concerned about. We all know that caste is a form of social stratification with graded inequalities and mostly very much assigned at birth. And it also has certain common features, endogamy, and it's a precondition of caste ascription. But I don't want to really go into this part, because assuming that most of us are familiar with. But what I would like to actually emphasize on is that caste has been defined in different ways depending on disciplines. So you have a religious approach, which essentializes caste system. So basically, if you look at from religious point of view, caste is predominantly looked at as a Vedic and ritual practice, and that furthers discrimination, and you also have an untouchability, discrimination, violence attached to a particular religious framework. But you also then have a political approach, resistance approach, where Ambedkar's constitutional representation, affirmative action, and then as a result of it, you have policy-oriented approach. And you have a political economy, sociological approach, philosophical approach. So there are a lot of ways so it is like actually blind men or blind humans touching an elephant in a dark room. You can come up with any sort of explanation, and everything is actually in some ways a part of the truth. However incomplete it is actually part of the truth. So my question here is that then why haven't we looked at caste from communications studies point of view? And people tend to ask me the question back, why should we do that? Because to them, I adopt communication oriented approach because it is conceptually and theoretically advances non-essentialist approaches, which is better suited to understand existing manifestation of caste system in today's complex everyday practices, which I will talk about when I unpack digital technology and politics. So to me, caste is actually, it is not just, I acknowledge that it is predominantly rooted in a particular religion, especially Hinduism. And, if you look at Ambedkar and Periyar and Phule, they've all actually acknowledged that caste is actually a very essential, they've approached anti-caste, their anti-caste policy is extremely, it's very much essentialist, something similar to what later Dumont actually practiced, advocated, theorized. However, if you look at untouchability and discrimination, for example, what's the extent of untouchability and discrimination in a crowded urban space? This is the argument I'm simplifying, it's very reductive, but this is the argument we are getting from the other side. So the other side tends to argue there is no caste now because We don't act. There is no. I mean, of course, there's some exceptional practices do occur, but generally, if you look at urban areas, caste is actually fading. Is it really? So that is where the nuanced approaches are required to understand remanifestation of caste practices in the world we live in today. And nothing is better suited to that approach than communications and cultural studies approach, which actually sort of includes digital cultures as well. And the reason why I argue this, because caste is a site of communication. So this is a point that I'm trying to conceptually put forth. Today, in any caste-affected societies, starting from India, caste is constituted of and constituted by communication, social communications, political communication, in economic communications, without which there is no social interactions. So the interactions may vary, but essentially caste actually, people often think caste is actually a very rigid system. Now, if you look at from communication studies point of view or cultural studies point of view, caste is extremely a fluid process. It retains its core venomous behavior, but the form and manifestation is extremely fluid, and which is why now, which I'll come to it in a minute, we will celebrate casteism in a very unconscious manner in today's globalized world. And that is actually furthered by digital cultures as well. So therefore, my short point is that communication studies approach is extremely important and has long been ignored. And this is nothing particularly, I'm not saying anything revolutionary here, because if you look at race, gender, sexuality, queer politics, they've all recognized communication approaches. For some reason, caste alone, as when you come to anti-caste studies, communication studies approach has absolutely been ignored, even though it affects the fifth of the world's population. So, but that's my case. The second case for communication studies approach is that it actually captures, it unsettles castelessness. So there is this growing argument that we are becoming casteless. And this is happening on two levels. One, which I just explained, that, looking at caste as a very rigorous practice, like there is no physical violence now, there is no sati now, there is no that, they pick up like a very extreme markers and argue that we are becoming casteless. The second thing is that, especially if you look at caste affected, especially if you look at outside South Asia, the diasporic communities, they often make a very loud claim that they remain casteless. And the reason is because you don't have any caste when the entire community is homogeneous. When the entire community belongs to a particular, I'm using the word community very consciously, but I abhor the word community. Caste is not community. Let me make it very clear. But the way the diasporic community organize themselves, they all belong to pretty much the same, within the same caste groups. Within that, they don't see any caste exist. Only now, post-globalization, when Dalits and Bahujans actually have migrated largely to the other side, it is making some eruption. The tectonic plates are changing. So communication studies, again, such as articulation, theory of articulation. If you look at the Cisco case, where this one particular dominant caste person outed a Dalit engineer, he didn't actually cause any physical violence. He didn't actually discriminate him per se in a very traditional caste sense, but he articulated. He simply spilt a fact in a public place, which actually reached the right people at the right time, and it kind of invoked casteism in a particular fashion. So this is why communication studies approach is very important to unsettle castelessness and critique castelessness. So that's the conceptual part. And I also talked about caste as a site of communication. The second bit I wanted to address is that technology. The technology faith, people that there is a very strong critical technology studies which kind of looks at technology and its emancipatory claims in a very critical manner. So there's nothing new I'm going to add there. However, it is very interesting to look at the critical internet studies or critical communication studies, critical technology studies people often claim themselves to be coming from a Marxist or a socialist tradition. And then you have techno-faith people either coming from centrist position or from far right, not far right, a capitalistic position. Let me put that way. In economic terms, not in political ideological terms. Okay, but however, if you look at the Marxist narrative, Marx actually makes a very interesting claim. He said, when communication infrastructure and technologies improve, caste will fade. He made a very specific claim. So Marx himself was a believer in technology. I can understand why, because coming from theory of surplus and capital, I totally get it. But he did believe that caste is something that can be wiped out because of materialistic intervention. And today, the Valley people do the same thing. So I'm just trying to caution here that the notion that technology can actually emancipate human misery, emancipate humans from their misery, caste misery, it's not particularly relegated to one particular ideological wing. It is even quite pervasive. It's something that we have to understand. And this is where the anti-caste thinking comes in and can unsettle both sides. It's very important. So, I mean, here is where I want to actually make a point about the post-independent, I don't want to use the word post-colonial, post-independent India's look at policy approach to technology and development. It's pretty much actually, it has become a preservation of dominant caste groups, as opposed to, if one looks at the pre-independent or 200 years, 300 years before, production, services, technology vastly belonged to Dalits and Bahujans. The paradigm shift itself is very interesting because the dominant caste group actually piggybacked with modernity and technology. So this is where Marx actually went wrong in some sense. Anyway, that's another talk for another day. So. So my point is, so today my limited talk will be, it's very limited to digital internet technologies. But I would just like to emphasize that my analysis is kind of largely applicable to all tech stories, if when viewed from caste as a site of communication. For example, online matrimonial sites, caste exclusive online spaces, hate speech, which I'm going to talk about. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to actually talk about caste hate speech, begin with caste hate speech, and I want to unpack what that means and how that actually, on one level, the sociology of casteism and caste and speech and caste and speech and articulation, and how that's actually been either misunderstood or exacerbated or distorted in the digital spaces. That's the kind of a parallel I'd like to bring in. So first of all, hate speech is a very common signifier. And I would like to, go back, I'd like to say Laclau's, it has become almost an empty signifier. Hate speech, you have to quantify hate speech. You have to have a very systemic marker, which I understand. In some cases, it does work. And absolutely fine. It's not a problem at all. But when it comes to caste hate, there is no such nuanced technical solutions. That is because caste hate speech has never been acknowledged. You have a racial hate, you have a sex-related sexism, you have misogyny, and so on and so forth. But there is nothing called casteism in digital space, which is very interesting. Given that it also reflects who's actually influencing who. Anyway, so absence of recognition despite globalization of caste, right? And then caste positivism. Then this is another thing. So people often talk about caste hate only in terms of victimhood and severeness, severity. In terms of severity, it has to be extremely offensive and so on and so forth. But caste hate is often actually emanates from caste positivism. And caste positivism normalizes caste hate speech. And in today's digital culture, caste positivism is phenomenal compared to, which has a very direct relationship to caste hate. Now, we have no, if you ask me, I have no answer, but we have to actually sit down and discuss this. How do we understand this caste positivism phenomenon, right? Because caste positivism stems from caste pride, and that is rooted in the faith in the caste system. And the reason why caste positivism is actually very powerful in today's world, because of digital cultures, where caste pride is often construed as a form of very legitimate multiculturalism, especially in the West. So if a person, let's say based out of the UK or US or Canada, and shares a post on a caste-based rituals and claims that this is my culture, and everyone backs off. So this is sort of a culturing caste is actually very much a norm in everyday digital culture, everyday practices and internet practices. And I just find it extremely amazed. It's amazing that, how there is no annotations, filters, labels around it. People even actually say casteist remarks when they talk about those rituals. I don't want to go into examples now here because I only have 20 minutes, but if you look at, I'm putting together an ethnography on what we call Upanayanam, which is like the sacred through a thread wearing ceremony. And around that, in the way that in the valley, people posted Twitter and Instagram around the week, it's absolutely mind-boggling. And the assertion of that pride literally is offensive to other people. They basically said, this is the reason why we are superior to others. That's a sort of a narrative. And also, when you actually pitch caste as a sort of as an identity, and a sort of a caste as a caste pride as multiculturalism, it gains enormous legitimacy in the West, which actually puts a huge break in places like the Valley, where we cannot actually make the necessary anti-caste steps. For example, in the UK, it's very common to have we have half a dozen Brahmin association in London itself, and when to become a member, you have to produce certain evidences that you belong to that particular group. And in the same way, all social media platforms have exclusive, normalized, legitimate, exclusive caste groups. And I don't think that would be entirely allowed if someone a misogyny group. I mean, they do exist, I'm not saying, but at least in principle, there might be a statement, we don't want to do that, we don't support that, but that's not the same case here. And also, this is actually perpetuated by the culturing caste is a very important point, because this is also perpetuated by Western Orientalist media narrative. A good example is in the UK, there is a magazine called the Prospect Magazine, and the Prospect Magazine ran a story on the reason why Brahmins or dominant caste groups are extremely tech wizards in the Valley is because they have actually mastered the idea of memorizing root learning because of the Vedic practices. So apparently the Veda actually have contributed to them to become better code writers, because they actually much more cautious, they don't make flaws, those sort of things. So this narrative is actually going on various levels, and it affects the people like us, who anti-caste people, to actually advance what needs to happen in digital spheres. And this takes us to the second point. When I say the prevents us means when I want to give an example, content moderation. And I don't want to name any social media platform, but I can tell you that most platforms do not have enough content moderation from caste perspective in caste-affected societies. They have no. I can vouch for that. And as a result. We some of us are trying to advance. They have to pay more attention to content moderation and so on and so forth. And some of the content moderations are not even happening in caste-affected societies. I know for a fact that there is a good amount of content moderation is happening in Philippines and in Singapore. in terms of what's been generated in India, especially in certain platforms. All I'm trying to say is that there is no significant attention paid to content moderation from cost perspective. And also content moderation is not just simply content when it comes from when you look at from cost anti-cost perspective, it is also about contextual moderation. I'll give you an example of that. What do I mean by content moderation and contextual moderation? So until recently, until pre-digital time, the word pariah, obviously the West has actually appropriated it and canonized it in a very, very loose manner and in a very insensitive manner. And I'm not going into the debate now. Hannah Arendt wrote the topic, essay, article on the Jew as a pariah. Weber has actually wrote about, talked about caste groups in Europe. But there's lots of a loose canonization happen. Objectionable, but it was happening in different places. But now post-digital area, what happened now? The same word, pariah, is now where the West actually creates the filter or annotating that what's a hate speech or not. They thought pariah is a very general word, no problem. It's already gained legitimacy in Oxford Dictionary, that's fine. And it also kind of a bizarre, but kind of makes sense to some extent. But then the unintended consequence is that when someone in Tamil Nadu or South India or India, caste-affected societies, when they call each other, when a dominant caste person actually, swears another person, you pariah, parian, whatever, even if you take that matter to Twitter or Facebook or any other content platforms, they will come back and say, there's nothing wrong because it's being used everywhere. So now the circulation is much more fluid because the content moderation is not contextually sensitive. Now the gate has been open and it's much more fluid in terms of circulation of this abuse and so on and so forth. And who benefits from this circulation? Dominant caste people. And what will they do? They will simply say that it's already been, Western people have already agreed to it. And caste, they will not talk about pariah, they will talk about cultures, that's all. So this is what I'm talking about, content moderation versus contextual moderation. And this, what does this mean? This means positionality matters in moderation, and also this goes back to representation. And this goes back to the representation. So front end is if it's a content moderation that needs to actually pay attention to. The middle ground is that representation and diversity, whether it's happening or not. That's the second part, and that's not happening because I always tell my friends. It's very funny that the taxonomy of ethnicity in the West is highly relegated to nationalities. You have describe your ethnicity? Indian. India is not an ethnic group. So this is how the taxonomy has been created, and that taxonomy has been actually built into the system. In terms of identifying people and so on and so forth. So therefore, there is no representation. So you have Indians, a lot of Indians, but within Indians, which Indians are there? We don't know. We know that, but data-wise, we don't have information. So we need more representation from oppressed caste groups in these spaces, but it's not happening, especially at the company corporate levels. And the reason, the other thing is that. Similar to hate speech, I'd like to take a moment to talk about disinformation and misinformation analysis. If you look at the sort of a disinformation and misinformation analysis, policy and practice, especially I'm talking about, and also in an academic area, in an academic side as well, they are largely rooted in science and technology studies tradition. They are again dehumanized to a large extent. That's unfair to say. There are a good amount of progressive work is happening, but definitely from cost perspective, I can say it's not happening. So disinformation it's been there for a long period of time. True, corporates actually do certain kind of disinformation to advance profits, to misinform people, and so on. That's there. But on a daily basis, it's actually propaganda and hate speech. But when you talk about disinformation, propaganda and hate speech, they do not actually feature. It's been sanitized. So one of the things that I actually would like, I argue that how do we shift the terms of debate from from a very depoliticized disinformation analysis into when you talk about caste, how do we really unpack that political economy and then sociology of caste and everyday practices and how that's being manifested in the digital world. The other thing that I would like to point out, the problem with the way that the Valley looks at some of the theoretical construct of artificial intelligence or machine learning, human HCI, and so on and so forth, is that the fairness principle. There's been a lot of theories and literature written about fairness principle, and one can easily come across that fairness principle in the West when writing about machine learning codes and so on. They are normally actually loosely based on John Rawls' theory of distributive justice. So this Rawlian theory of distributive justice is actually very interesting, but I would just say that I don't want to diss it, but I would say that it is not helpful to implement a strong anti-caste culture in the digital area. I'll give you an example. So Rawls' theory of distributive justice, it talks about, if we have one guitar and there are three people who want, three boys or three children who claim to have this guitar, each one can come up with a certain sort of a reason, and then each reason can be valid on the grounds of theory of impartiality, because we don't know anybody's background. So theory of impartiality is a precondition to distributive justice. Therefore, fairness can be achieved. For example, if the first child says, I'm a greatest guitar player at 10 years old, I'm only 10 years old. Oh, then you deserve a guitar. It's a good, valid reason. The second person said, I have no guitar at all. Oh my God, then you should have a guitar. The third person can say that, I have no money to buy a guitar. And then, okay, then you should have it. So you have theory of impartiality can go either way, right? Whereas Ambedkar's social justice is actually, no, hang on a minute. We have to really look at one particular view, which is like affirmative action, which is rooted in certain exclusive oppression, dominance, and those sort of elements. That is not that's kind of different from Rawls' theory of justice. When Shadi.com introduced caste filters, they simply, when people question Shadi.com, they simply said, it's not out. We just actually encourage customers to put in a caste if they want, then we will add filters to it. That's all. And customers did it. So it's a theory of impartiality, right? So we just have to look at those sort of de-Westernizing fairness principle. Looking at revisiting some of these theoretical construct from anti-caste perspective is also very important. So how do we move forward? Do I have 5 minutes? Is that okay? I'll wrap it up. Yeah. Okay. So how do we move forward? As I said, we need to have a very, and the anti-caste agenda should have the first point is that very strong 3-layered approach. The first one is how do we actually, monitor and how do we fine-tune the engines so that they become very cost sensitive. So that requires content moderation and so on, contextual moderation. But it also actually means the mid-level representation. You need people, cost-sensitive population, tech population, which are currently missing. That's one thing. The last one is that, as I talked about the fairness principle, you need to build a machine, very cost-sensitive machine. So we need to have for example, I always tell people, why don't we have a hackathon on, putting people together to build cost filters and annotations, because it's very vast. In different languages and in cultures, it's very differently expressed. I don't think anybody. So development organizations such as, I'm not saying that you do or don't. I don't know anything about it, but IT and development organization or IT and research think tanks can do a very large influential role, but they are not playing. This is another problem. So if you look at AI, big data, and IT, tech, policy advocacy agencies, they actually pander to the caste-less Western tech narrative because that is in their favor. And I hope you guys understand what I'm trying to say. So that is in their favor. So in aid of their own positionality, they are happy to take that caste-less Western narrative. And that needs to change as well. So this is that's another point that I'd like to talk about. I would like to emphasize how international development, especially tech associated, rights associated international development agencies are deafening or maintaining deafening silence when it comes to anti-caste related issues. But it is the same community who are highly vocal about racial related digital rights, sexual oriented digital rights, gender related digital rights, but not caste related one, anti-caste related one. So some of these things is actually kind of I'm trying to address. This is what largely prompted me to create this critical caste and technology studies module. So this module essentially kind of critically looks at documents, the history of caste and philosophy of caste from communication studies point of view, or it kind of recalibrates existing material from communication studies point of view, and then sort of a look at it questions the critical media studies, which are extremely rooted in westernized castelessness. I don't want to go into the detail. I have a fantastic example, but I'll reserve it for a Q&A if that's possible, if that's appropriate. The last one is that we are also actually we are continuing this phenomenon, what I call remanifestation of caste as culture in technologies, caste as actually a ritual, caste as a practice, as casteism in digital technologies continue to happen. The one good example which I'd like to end with is the platform economy. So every time people talk about platform economy, there is always this notion of a emancipatory politics of casteless labor. But we know that there is no casteless labor in caste-affected societies. And the research agenda is not very helpful either. It also actually glosses over, sanitizes labor as in a very Marxist tradition, and then it doesn't actually necessarily get into the nuances of it. I can go into examples again, but I'd just like to say one example here, rating politics. So if you look at the rating politics of domestic care platform industry, if one has the ability, when one has the nuances to look at from caste and gender intersectionality perspective, I think we will get a lot of the extension of legacy biases in digital economy. As such, we know for a fact there is one company called bookmymaid.com. The name itself is highly questionable and very insensitive in many ways. And there you will have, when you choose your maid, you can choose very interestingly, Tamil vegetarian, the interesting markers, disguised markers. And in the same way that there is intermediary taxi services in India, there's a guy in Mumbai, he runs a blog, and he actually made a very public claim that driver from rural Mumbai from certain communities here, communities are docile, very loyal, but don't hire anyone from Mumbai. These urban fellas talk too much. So you can see all this is continuing to happen. So unless we actually raise ourselves to be more sensitive, we can't do this. So in a nutshell, there are three things I'd like to emphasize. One is there is the need to look at anti-caste or caste-related studies from communications studies point of view. Number two, we need to actually pay attention to not just brutal form of violence, but also communicative form of violence and everyday reactions. And three, we need to be very alertful and then unsettle existing digital policy and regulation from anti-caste perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Murali, for your insights, your inputs on so many of them, but your concepts on caste positivism, caste hate speech, lack of focus on content and contextual moderation from a caste perspective, de-westernized fairness principles were especially interesting. Your expertise has been very valuable for today's call, and I can personally say that I have learned a lot from you today. Now, coming to you, Aarushi, thank you for being so patient. Given that you're a PhD scholar, why don't you tell us about the current feature and the limitations there?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tejasi. Thank you, first of all, Dr. Murali, for that very illuminating and also agitating talk. And I will try my best to respond to some of the points from what I know of this field. And yeah, thank you to Internet Freedom Foundation for organizing this. So I think first of all, I would like to address the very important point, which is the emancipatory potential of technology, as Marx also claimed. But at the same time, the lack of anti-caste perspective in technological development. Now, this is more than polemic because it is important to understand who is considered meritorious enough to be a technocrat in India, to design technologies that then determine who gets public and private services, as was clear in Dr. Murali's example about the very offensive website called bookmymaid.com. But for public services, I want to first focus on the issue of Aadhaar and public service delivery through Aadhaar in India. Now, this must not remain an abstraction as to who is designing the infrastructure to deliver public services through Aadhaar, because I think it is very important to remember the name Santoshi Kumari, who was 11 years old when she died of starvation in 2017 in Jharkhand. Santoshi Kumari came from a Mahadalit community, which is something I want to emphasize. And remember that she died of starvation because her family did not get rations that they were entitled to because of Aadhaar card induced exclusion. So I think this is the reason that it is very important to think about technology and exclusion from an anti-caste perspective, because who are the people who are getting affected and who are the people who are designing these technologies. Then if I were to go into the communication aspect of internet technologies, and I think the points about content and contextual moderation that were raised by Dr. Murali are very important here. Again, I want to emphasize what is the identity of people who are sitting in the Silicon Valley or in the offices in Bangalore that determine what is the content that is worthy of being moderated. So, for instance, we know that during the farmers' protests, farmers' accounts were blocked on Twitter. But at the same time, there is unchecked functioning of blatantly casteist Facebook groups that demand disbanding of reservation in India. So apart from that, we've also had instances of live streaming of Muslim habitations during the event of 2020 Delhi program on TikTok, and all of these things were not considered worthy of being moderated. So these are, I think, important things to think about. So apart from that, I wanted to say that there is some research on caste networks, but this is mostly among prominent politicians, so sort of like at the elite level, especially on Twitter, because I don't think Twitter is entirely representative of an average Indian's engagement with social media. It seems to me that Twitter is where people go to seek opinions of the elite. But there also, it is very important to recognize the existence of caste networks. But still, I think we don't have enough insight on how a critical mass of people from oppressor castes mobilize hate online. So there is, I think, a systematic dearth of research into paths to radicalization. The research which sort of exists in the US for alt-right groups, how sort of Proud Boys mobilize online hate and stuff like that. But these paths to radicalization are not first acknowledged in the presence of India and therefore not studied. But then I think the big questions that need to be answered by understanding these paths to radicalization is, how do you explain trends in hate speech? Are they merely backlash of dominant caste groups? Or is it the case that everyday forms of violence stem from plain bigotry of caste societies? So these are things I think we want to understand. I think about the important points that Dr. Murali raised about development research, development think tanks, and the questions that they're asking. Again, I think who is conducting this research on hate speech, I think has just been sort of like dismissed, as it is perceived that hate speech is driven by paid actors, paid trolls, who are, or like influential political actors that are influencing common innocent folk. I think this obscures the fact that social media users from oppressor castes are actively exercising agency in engaging with hateful content when they're exposed to it. So on the one hand, we must acknowledge agency to build online communities. So we do see sort of anti-caste communities emerging in places like Facebook and Twitter, and frankly, anti-caste news portals, which have become the main source of news for a lot of people. But also, I think there's less attention on the agency to exert violence, perhaps because, as Dr. Murali pointed out, there's no acknowledgement of these differences from a westernized perspective, or a normalization in the multicultural sort of paradigm of things. Then I wanted to focus on measurement, which is something, again, that Dr. Murali has very rightly pointed out. Now, the way that we measure, how do we measure casteist and anti-minority hate speech itself? Now, these are very Western paradigms where you might have that human labelers are labeling a subset of posts as hateful or not. And these typically have, some words that are recognized as being hateful. But these sort of technologies of measuring hate speech totally miss the point of in a caste-ridden society. The reasons for that are multiple. One, I think, is very basic and very important to point out, is the language of communication. I think like most of this data labeling is happening in English, even though I am aware of some hate speech or toxic speech algorithms that are able to recognize toxicity in multiple languages. But it is important to understand that this paradigm is focused on English. So how do we sort of translate those contexts into English? And it is important to also understand what gets lost in the translation from say, Indian regional languages to English, and then scoring those that discourse in toxicity. The other thing that these measures of hate speech totally miss is caste positivism, which, as Dr. Murali pointed out, is legitimized by multiculturalism. Now, there is nothing in the toxicity scores algorithm that has learned to sort of recognize caste positivism as being violent or toxic. And that is because what is being labeled, what is the sort of corpus of content that is being labeled as casteist does not recognize caste positivism or caste cultures as being toxic, which is why all of this sort of like flies under the radar and is not focused on. So the other thing that I think is very difficult to measure on social media, for instance, is how do you measure caste homophily in online networks? Apart from blatant examples like shadi.com or IIM-shadi.com or stuff like that, where people the blatant asking and telling of caste, I think it's sort of like very difficult to measure, especially caste in these online networks. And so that, I think, becomes a big barrier to research. Now, these are, I think, not just the intellectual curiosities. I think they are very important in a dynamically sort of evolving role that technologies are playing in mundane structures of oppression. And not just, maybe I shouldn't say mundane, but the active structures of oppression as we've seen in the various examples that were given by Dr. Murali. The other thing is there is policy relevance for measurement. And this policy relevance is important to build sort of an important public sphere because social media is in fact where public opinion is being formulated. And if we want to actually think of a participative democracy where there is equitable participation of oppressed groups, then we have to be really thinking of how to make cyberspace more habitable for everyone. And I think their moderation plays an important role. And that goes back to the point about acknowledging what needs to be moderated first and who is going to acknowledge what needs to be moderated if these tech spaces are sort of so sanitized from any sort of anti-caste. The last thing that I want to talk about is about AI fairness. And I think these are really important points. There's a huge literature in computer science and even sociology in the US that talks about AI fairness, mostly from an outcomes perspective. I think there is some flexibility in terms of how do you define fairness, which I don't want to get into because I think it gets really technical. But at the same time, I think even though there is flexibility in defining what is fair and what is unfair, I think a lot again flies under the radar because there is no acknowledgement of what is unfair in those technical terms in a very sort of westernized perspective of these debates. So for instance, in the Shadi.com example, the very notorious Shadi.com example, there are explicit caste filters, but then they would never have explicit filters on what is your ability to pay dowry. So what is acceptable and what is not is kind of is defined by who is sort of designing these infrastructures. And I think I will stop there.
Thank you, Aarushi. The several examples that you provided today were very helpful in understanding this rather complex discourse, I would say. It was particularly great how you were able to supplement and elaborate on several of the points raised by Dr. Murali. Your research background has definitely been very beneficial in today's conversation. So thank you once again. We will now allow our audience to ask questions and to convey comments, if any. I would also urge our audience who's watching this live to please type your comments there itself, and we will try to address it right now. So we had a comment on LinkedIn. I'm going to paste it here for everyone, and I'm going to read it out as well. So it says, knowledge is either acquired or inculcated. Acquired is mostly distributed to more disciplines for shallow propagation, whereas inculcated is assigned to selected ones who go deeper and undertake intensive study, but that is not caste. Dr. Murali or Aarushi, would you like to say anything on this comment or add anything here?
I think these sort of expressions, acquired and inculcated, it sounds like very conditional, interventionist. I think one needs to liberate these signifiers. At least my thinking, and it's acquired is mostly distributed. That's a tangible. This is like sounds like Gandhi's trusteeship. Acquired is mostly distributed. I think that's a very. I am quite anti-trusteeship person, personally speaking. So I think what is acquired, the question is the politics behind the acquisition. That's what we are questioning. Is it what's the privilege? What is the network that actually enabled one to acquire? And how do we unpack what one acquired actually? Did it happen in a very neutral environment? Hardly ever. So and the thing is that distributed to more disciples for shallow propagation. I don't understand that. Whereas inculcated is assigned to selected ones who go to but that is not a caste. Then what it is then? Okay. This sounds like a meritorious advocacy. That's fine. I'm each to their own. I'm not going to actually argue here. We don't have time. But all I'm trying to say is that, I mean, the concepts like acquisition, knowledge, wealth, merit, all these need to be unsettled from, and it can be unsettled if one looks at from not necessarily anti-caste perspective, but also from feminist perspective, also from queer perspective. If any protected categories, if you deploy, if their particular politics, if you deploy their politics on these concepts will eventually wither. So that is my very generic intervention. Yeah. Sorry, if that's not helpful, I'm so sorry.
Aarushi, do you have anything to add, or we have another question we can take?
Yeah, no, I think I completely agree with Dr. Murali here. Like, this does seem like a very specific meritocratic viewpoint, which is something that needs to be unseated at its very core. So yeah, I'm happy to take the next question.
Okay, Ramya, why don't you unmute and ask a question?
Hello, am I audible? Hello. Yes. Okay, great.
Yeah.
I had a question regarding the ownership of research especially in caste-based discussions. So there is an ongoing debate as to whether Savarnas or upper caste people can actually research or talk or speak about more Bahujan related matters. And not that doesn't happen anyways, but there is resistance to it. There is this like push and pull between ownership as to who should be the ones advocating or writing and speaking and thinking about Bahujan rights or Bahujan like issues in general. My question is basically, especially given that there is when it comes to technology, it's a matter of privilege, right? Not everyone has access to online spaces and communities or research that goes in academia to conduct these kind of in detail studies. So how do we make sense of this? Like, how do we where does this fall? Is it fine that we have upper caste people speaking about it, or is it necessarily something that Bahujans have to take a lead, while acknowledging that there is a disparity in allocation of resources and access to the internet in general? I hope I kind of made some sense.
Yeah. Thanks, Ramya, for that question. I think the point you've made about acknowledging disparities in resources to begin with is an important one. But I think it's also one of the reasons that is often given to not include Bahujan people in research about themselves. Like maybe a small example that I can give is from my time as a student at Delhi School of Economics, where the failure rate for the Dalit Bahujan students was higher than students coming from so-called general categories. And the reason that was given was that the standards of the institution, like academic standards of the institutions, cannot be lowered. I think that's really an excuse. Because the objective of research institutions is to exactly build capacities in communities that were not represented before, to then come to that standard, or whatever that standard, like not even questioning that standard right now, but to come to that standard and then sort of like do that research. So I think also in the context of the US, for instance, in the hiring of Black women, for instance, in educational institutions, you hear a lot of academic institutions complaining that there are no Black women in the pipeline who can then be sort of like hired for these academic positions. Again, I think that does sort of acknowledge disparities in resources to begin with, but is not really doing anything about it and is therefore an excuse. So I feel like there is some notion of merit which is already set, which needs to be changed. And also at the same time, like I think that there needs to be capacity building to sort of build what the Americans call the pipeline. Some of this work we're doing at Bahujan Economists. So for instance, we have capacity building workshops regularly. Like we're rooted in anti-caste principles and that, like we're political in that, but at the same time, like we do sort of build up the resources so that our students are sort of like competitive in whatever notion of merit or gold standard that is out there. So I think it's kind of probably both ways, but most of the times the lack of representation on account of like a lack of people from marginalized and oppressed communities in the pipeline seems more of an excuse than like a real concern to me.
I completely agree. Can I just say one thing before Shyam comes? I think the question Rami asked is, people always ask me these questions, and I just want to say one thing, which is it's not about you. The way you framed actually revealed the problem. Now, can we not talk about it? It's about solidarity plank. It's about building solidarity. It's not about you talking about it. So that's the kind of positionality politics of positionality. Number two, I think dominant caste people have a huge responsibility to build anti-caste solidarity by looking and exposing their own space. Because if you look at policy and academic space, it's always actually the gaze has been perpetuated. It's not actually interrogating the power holders. So if you want to actually contribute something, if not you mean you, but if a dominant caste scholar or actually an activist or a policy wants to contribute, the best place to start is oneself. And if extending that to the digital culture policy wonk think tanks, why is it that there are so many ICT, digital rights, tech policy think tanks in caste-affected societies do not talk about caste? Because their positionality, which I talked about, right? So that's the sort of a reversing the positionality is a kind of a solidarity plank which people are seeking to, to have that plank. That's all. Thanks. I stop here.
Yes, Shyam, you can ask the question.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the opportunity and thanks for the talks, illuminating conversation, and us, many others, I've learned a lot. So my question was, in a nutshell, is there even an algorithmic anti-caste, anti-caste stance or a perspective that is possible? And at this current moment, I work in AI, and the ontology of anything that's human subjectivity or the replication of the real world is always facing degradation. And given what we know of solidarity in research, in online solidarity, we see that it's very difficult to hold on to a specific set of ideals and make it last long. So how do you see this playing out? Is there even an anti-caste algorithmic space at all?
I'm going to skirt around and answer this question, Shyam. I think the point I think the way where I come from is that the conversation hasn't even started in many ways. So I would personally think that people like you and I have to sit down and thrash out what's the basic element. For example, how do we even begin to understand the casteist sentiments? How do we do that? How do we measure these sentiments? I just like, and also how do we actually pull together basic labels or filters? I don't think we are. I mean, you can tell me if I'm wrong. So I think the first thing is that the conversation is yet to happen, and I know that some conversation happening in some places in very sparsely, but this is one of the things I would really love to talk to people like you. So sit down and actually thrash out that what is actually feasible, and there is not even a feasibility plan to actually proceed for. Correct me if I'm wrong, and that's what I'm actually aspiring us to do together.
Yeah, I think this is, I think, a really great question. Sham, as you know, there's a large literature in CS and in sociology that is looking at algorithmic fairness, and there seems to be some advance in the fields of gender and critical race studies. I think there also, it depends on what school of thought you come from. I must preface it with that. There is a school of thought that agrees that it is impossible to achieve any sort of algorithmic fairness in a society that is fundamentally unequal, because all algorithms are based on training data, and that training data comes from the real world where agents are imperfect, right? But I think despite this agreement, there has been some progress that is made on sort of anti-racism focused algorithmic fairness practice in the US. And so I think, like, I agree with Dr. Murali that we need to start having those conversations. And even though I don't think we can completely go towards algorithmic practice where we have annihilated caste, but I think we can try to get closer if we open up the conversation about caste.
I mean, I'm just thinking that out, completely thinking aloud. Is it not possible to have a filter and labels on caste-less by running a hackathon? Can we not do that? Can we not do that in 10 languages or even one language to begin with? And why can't we even begin to think about that? That's the sort of I'm not saying that it's a great idea, but I'm just saying that's the kind of a thinking that we should thrash about and talk about it. Yeah. Thank you, Sham.
So I know we are way over time, but if it's okay with you, Aarushi and Dr. Murali, can we take that one last question and then we can end the session? It's on the chat. I will just read it out. It says, would the design of platforms like Twitter be radically different if they were designed with anti-caste politics and people? Or is it likely to remain largely the same with slight tweak in moderation? Doctor, I think you're on.
I think, okay, it's a very interesting, this is a very deterministic question. So what road are we going to take? But my thinking is that that's actually putting the cart ahead of the horse before we think about, I think it needs to be a gradual evolutionary process. I think we need to sit down, like this question directly goes back to what Shyamji just asked, how do we actually roll this out? So my suggestion is that we need to actually start with something tangible. Why don't we at least even source all caste-less in one language and see how that works? And also the problem with caste, here's an example. I'm sure if Sham is around, he might actually even contribute. It doesn't have to be that you and me and Aarushi. It can be a democratic platform. If there is an N-word being communicated between two Afro-Americans, the AA engine doesn't actually flag up because it's fine-tuned. Whereas if the N-word is actually transacted between in an interracial context, looking at the profile, then it is flagged up. In the same way, when we talk about certain words in certain caste contexts, it can actually also, let's say, a reservation. It can be used either as a token of resistance politics. It can also be used as a casteist reference. So how do we understand that? So this is where we need to actually sit down and then have that kind of a build. So like what Aarushi said, we need to actually, this has happened in other segments. race, sexuality, queer, everything, right? So this is not undoable, but we need to sit down and build those kind of everyday life situations, and how can we translate that into filters and data? That's what I'm trying to say. So it is not either or. How we're going to, I don't know. How it's going to be, I don't know. I mean, Aarushi might actually join here.
Yeah, I think this is a very hard question. It's very difficult to imagine the counterfactual from the current position, but I think we can only lean on examples from what we know from experiences in the US with respect to sort of moderating Islamophobic posts, for instance, which is something maybe we can, which is the closest to sort of what is happening in India right now. But I think, yeah, it's really hard to say if it would be like a radical reimagination of what you have on Twitter or right now. And I think there are way too many factors involved in that to sort of like give a conclusive answer about what the counterfactual would be. But I think definitely going back to our discussion, there are places where we can start and we haven't started yet. And there are like these, I think the hackathon for doing caste labeling is an excellent idea, which is something I think we should organize resources to start doing right away, so that a content moderation algorithm or a toxicity algorithm is able to recognize that when someone from a dominant caste is talking about a reservation, that content is toxic and needs to be moderated.
Okay, I guess that brings today's event to an end. I cannot thank Dr. Murali and Aarushi enough. I am very glad that we were able to organize this talk on a much needed topic, despite the fact that we are all situated in 3 different time zones. For your time and valuable insights, and I'm sure our audience is extremely grateful. I hope to continue these collaborations moving forward and look forward to reading more of your work. Thank you once again for taking our time on a Friday evening or morning or afternoon, and have a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you so much for organizing. Thank you, Dr. Murali.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Bye.